Recently, I had the opportunity to discuss the character of Anders in Dragon Age 2, and how I feel his writing operates at the levels of both social metaphor and romantic engagement, centered around how a player might learn about the setting and the real world through understanding Anders and vice versa. However, I also felt it would be a bit optimistic when writing that essay to think that everyone would automatically see the validity of Anders' perspective due to his moral grayitude, or even the general validity of the ability to see ideas about queerness reflected in video game storytelling, except in only the most direct and limited contexts. Because of this, and because of a number of parallel factors, I felt the need to build that central thesis out into a secondary essay. This essay, an essay about religion and spirituality and Dragon Age. I've put some effort into engaging with scholarship around Christian ideas in a way that I hope comes across in future essays down the line, and it helps growing up Catholic and having studied some philosophers who contributed to discourses about Christianity, but here I think we have to begin differently. I've seen some discussion of late regarding the identity of a Christian game and what that really means. But I believe we're at something of a deficit culturally in understanding what a Christian work of art really means. Commonly cited works of Christian fiction in the fantasy genre are The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia, for some older examples by two of the Inklings, but there are the occasional modern works like the Mistborn series of books that come up. I've never been a big Mistborn evangelist, and I more or less left Narnia behind since I grew older, but Tolkien has a special place in my heart and always will. However, I've noticed in discussions of his work that there's a strong tendency to litigate by proxy whether his authorial intent was to spread Christian values by arguing about how the world of Arda represents Christian ideas. This is a subject to which I would like to return independently, but it's worth mentioning that Tolkien didn't treat his work with that kind of evangelical spirit. There may be a kind of cultural homogenization occurring, from the Red Scare to the MAGA movement, where Christianity at large is polarized into evangelical reaction and something more compatible with secular society. But when I was growing up, most Catholics I met, even a number of priests, treated that kind of approach to religious discourse as childish. And I can imagine that whether Tolkien felt the same, a number of Christian artists historically probably have. The expectation many people seem to have of art is this same evangelical expectation, that its themes and ideas bear some kind of morally didactic cross. Some people seem to come away surprised that American Psycho operates in a manner wholly different from VeggieTales, and if they're genuinely affronted by that, I think it exposes a kind of immaturity. I can relate. Developing our engagement with the arts is a lifelong process, and I hope to be more mature at the end of every year into which I pour that sort of effort than I was at the start. Letting go of the need to see the ideas and emotions within a work of art as a prescription has been liberating, but it's also not the same as a work of art being non-political. I think it makes more sense to cultivate an openness to expression that doesn't require us to immediately respond as if we're scandalized by proximity to ideas. Words are not literal enchantments. A book, a film, a video game does not literally cast a spell on us and walk us immediately into having one of the good or bad beliefs. Not at least if we have our eyes open and our ears to the ground. The compulsion of Christian artists to be morally didactic in many ways is the cause for the poor reputation of much of contemporary Christian art, in spite of the success of creatives like George R.R. Martin, George Lucas, and Ghost, all of whom have created books, films, and music with strong Christian cultural affects and inspirations to the joy of millions and millions of people. Some Christians might feel the need to object to the idea that these are really Christian works on the basis of the identity of the author, or the basis of the didactic quality of the work in light of a Christian worldview. But I would argue that a mature culture creates diversity and deviation specifically as a way to propagate and engage with its ideas and practices. Art is perfect for this. Art communicates, it reaches into the hearts of many and shows them their own feelings in a mirror, all because someone wrote a story or maybe a massive team of people produced a video game. Of course, given the aforementioned poor reputation of Christian art, it is quite funny to suggest that Dragon Age 2 is probably the most broadly Christian game of the lot, albeit with some standout quests from the others, because it is broadly considered the worst. Without sinking too far into that morass, I should say that Dragon Age 2 was one of my favorite fantasy RPGs for a long time, and still has a warm place in my heart even over the wildly more popular Dragon Age Origins. I'm a bit of an Inquisition fan, however, so that one takes the cake for me, and we'll get there in due time. I do feel I have a track record of insisting that an overlooked or maligned game in a series is better than its billed as being. What with the whole minor Dark Souls 2 revival I've been seeing over the past couple years, I suppose I should expect a Mass Effect 3 reevaluation any day now, and everybody already seems to have come to the conclusion that Halo 3 ODST is great, so really, I'm hoping Dragon Age 2 gets its flowers sometime in the future. It deserves them. The thing that makes Dragon Age 2 so inspiring to write about, though, is actually the intimacy of the setting. The entire game, post-tutorial, takes place in one big city, and its surrounding mountain range. I guess you could count the Deep Roads separately, but here they're basically treated as an area underneath Kirkwall, so it's still more or less the same place in the world. I think if we got more Dragon Age games, players might be more welcoming to the idea of the smaller scale, which in addition to repetitive encounters and reused assets, is a necessity of the extremely limited development time. I get the disappointment, although if this had been an indie studio, I'd have been excited for its future after playing this game, and it was my first, so really I have no dog in that fight. But it's the characters and the narrative of Dragon Age 2 that I find so compelling. A lot of interesting stuff happens in Dragon Age Origins, but as discussed previously in another video about world building, the story takes you to a lot of different places that tie themes and ideas together. Here, we get a sort of opposite effect, where the developers were less concerned or less able to draw the conflict out over a huge amount of space. So instead, they use a large amount of time and a dependable cast of characters to walk the player through the game's narrative. In addition to this approach to writing the world of Dragon Age, the DA2 developers commit a second and third cardinal sin of RPG writing, which involve limited character customization and relatively fixed outcomes in world state. I think this is all wonderful, but I can understand why people would react negatively. For one thing, fantasy RPGs have been sold on how playable their worlds are as games, which can create sometimes the impression, at least, that gameplay variety is more important than a compelling story. There are games, entire series of games, and in fact entire genres of games, for which this is not the case, but the perception is public power. If Hawke is less customizable than the Warden or Inquisitor, and I'll say this for Origins, wow, I mean, what an immersive degree of customization that game had, it's still going to feel bad when compared to the player's expectation, even if the story of Hawke is actually quite a good one. If the game slants the story such that the mages tend to appear more sympathetic than the Templars, it's likely that even though many find the story compelling, from the perspective of many reflecting on the experience of playing it, there exists an offensive lack of buttons to push, knobs to turn, and levers to pull. Input complexity feels wasteful in the face of a lack of output complexity, but then again, this is true of any cutscene where a boss that you just injured in any number of ways dies in one specific way. Ultimately, the story is not merely the destination but the journey, so needing to face the same series of trials and resolve them in the same limited number of ways for the same limited number of end states isn't always a concern. It can be, but even within that space, a good game can still be born. That is essentially what I think has happened with Dragon Age 2. The companions operate on a friendship rivalry system that will prime them to stand by Hawke or betray Hawke in combination with narrative decisions Hawke makes. Besides that, most of the story plays out the same every time. Additionally, there's a mechanical end to this input-output complexity disparity. Dragon Age 2's combat system might not be as diverse and experimental, focused more on skill trees than simple progressions working in combination, but even within that purview, the swap to punchy attacks and powerful-looking cooldowns is still quite pleasant. However, these fun combat tricks will be used on a pretty repetitive cast of enemies in a pretty repetitive series of areas. So the game is trying to sell you on doing a lot of the same thing because you like it that much, to not only beat the game once, but also return to it for much the same series of outcomes on future characters. Most of the diversity comes from builds, companion relationships, and dialogue delivery, which is a far cry from the world state variants in Origins or even Inquisition. All of this is to say that I love Dragon Age 2, in all of its understated imperfection. It's not the perfect game, and it's not my or most people's favorite Dragon Age game, but I love it every time all the same. In reviews and retrospectives of this game, I've noticed there's a good tendency to highlight the flaws of Dragon Age 2, but a certain lack of attentiveness to a lot of the meaning and deliberate choices behind many elements of the design. Without naming any names, because everyone involved appears otherwise decent but maybe a little misled, I'd like to draw attention to the structure of Kirkwall, the city of the game's setting. Varric describes Kirkwall as the city of chains, and indeed, massive iron chains are strung between massive slave statues outside the city. A former slaver's city, Kirkwall's architecture nevertheless gives the impression of all too human oppression, something binding all who live within. But to what? The law? The nobility? The racial supremacist order? The chantry and its Templars? Regardless of one's station, those who lie within are bound by fate. But the architecture of Kirkwall and the chaining of the human spirit extends well beyond its literal chains and slave visages honoring cruel old gods and crueler magisters. In fact, the layout of the city itself is a sort of literal elevation of the upper classes above the lower ones. And of course, that brings with it the elevating of different kinds of people common to those classes as well. The greatest chains of all in this city may be the social order of Kirkwall itself, seemingly so natural that it's carved into the stone as a fact of height and gravity. Kirkwall is a monster of hostile architecture. The presence of spikes, for example, pervade the entire lower levels of the city, atop buildings and along railings and even on the faces of the buildings. This design choice has been given very little attention except in passing remarks, in my experience, but the sheer violence that pervades the environment cannot go understated. Sheer walls and lightless towers collaborate with rusted spikes and iron chains to develop a landscape of torment and suffering. It also makes sections of the game itself difficult to play for that fact alone. It's depressing enough as an environment without getting into the slavery and the betrayal and the allegories for queer oppression and racism and all manner of things. Digital environments can, insofar as I can tell, cause the same sort of psychic impression as real-world architecture. Any structure that shapes the environments of human beings can have ramifications for the outlook, lifestyle, ideology, and general spirit of a person, I think. And I was originally convinced of this possibility through an interview Alan Moore once did with Will Menaker. For example, when describing the Christchurch Spitalfields building, Moore was asked about this view and had this to say.
And I think even in From Hell, you describe how the geometry of it appears flat if you're looking at it straight on, but then if you approach it from a different angle, like all the angles sort of change. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about Hawksmoor and also just sort of the unseen power of architecture holds over us, which I think you've discussed before in your work.
Well, yeah, I mean, like it seems to me, the further I get away from Hell, the more that seems to be completely true. That the buildings that surround us, they completely dictate our psychologies. That the landscapes that we exist in, we're going to internalize them, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're living in a place that appears to you to be a kind of rat trap, then inevitably you're going to come to the conclusion that you're probably some kind of rat. Whereas if you know anything about the place in which you're living, if you can invest all that bricks and mortar with some history, some mythology, whatever, then you can transform the place that you're living into somewhere out of the Arabian Nights, into a fantastic magical wonderland. And if you're living in that kind of environment, you might eventually come to the conclusion that you could be a wondrous creature.
I went out of my way to read From Hell in preparation for this essay, and while as a visual novel or series of comics, it's a bit of its own beast, to be considered in its own measure, it did set the tone for engaging with Dragon Age 2, perhaps better than 100 video essays or articles written for the internet. I was particularly touched by Moore's advocacy, which upon re-listening I had quite forgotten, that artists, as he says, should woman up and take our roles as artists seriously. I was struck writing from where I am with the comedy of being, as they say in the business, an influencer, while debating the exertion of a type of influence that Moore seemed to rightfully treat with such seriousness. The big, bloody burden of artists everywhere is often seen as entertaining, for the constitutionally unserious and truth-telling for the philosophically self-serious. But the truth in both of these is the social power present in art and the necessity for safeguarding and shepherding that power. Taking art seriously is a practice in not spitting in the face of the entire human race and every person who has ever suffered or loved, and requires a type of sincerity that is made difficult by discomfort or anxiety in proximity to being judged by the little annoying versions of other people that we conjure in our own heads. We have to be willing to appreciate that a meaning found is a meaning taken. A single brushstroke, a single musical note, and a single pixel on a screen all have enough meaning to measure the collective time spent pondering them in human lifetimes, and that is enough, I think, to require a seriousness of mind in approaching them. The magic and religion in all of Dragon Age is quite at home in Dragon Age 2, in a manner that almost subordinates the real magic of the setting to the realer power of the setting's tapestry. This fact returns a bit of the mundanity of church and religion to the Chantry and its Templars. Dragon Age 2 is consequently arguably the most lived-in that the games have felt before or since, at least prior to playing the future title Dreadwolf that has been recently teased and retitled as Veilguard. The notion of a sort of magical manipulation of human psychology by digital space draws attention to the themes implicit in areas like the Elven alienage, with a great tree surrounded by leering stone walls and spikes, or even the redundancy of some of the areas in gameplay where the whole game invokes this kind of too familiar drudgery that isn't pleasant to play any more than it would be to really live in it. Moore pontificates on these ideas about magic, but draws them in the end back to an idea common also to the writer H.P. Lovecraft, who speculated that human knowledge would be drawn together and unified, and that this might be more of a curse than a blessing. As Moore puts it, Lovecraft feared mankind might draw away from the light of this new knowledge and into the comfortable shadows of a new Dark Age. And indeed, there are some ways in which the internet and rising fundamentalism and reactionary belief have borne out this prediction in our current era. The video game is itself an artistic product of that era, and therefore can only exist in its light and possibly the light of certain possible futures. No one played Metal Gear Solid or Dark Souls or Castlevania in St. Peter's Basilica in the year 1300, and that's not just because the building itself wasn't finished in its construction until the year 1626, about 120 years after the construction had begun, making it at least as modern as it was medieval, befitting of a structure birthed in the Renaissance. The point can be taken further in sincerity. No, they didn't play Super Mario in ancient Rome, and neither did the Spartans and Athenians quarrel over whether 6v6 would fix Overwatch. It may seem a stupidly obvious point, but think about this same fact in relation to all electronically dependent works of art like film and television. Think about the internet. The pull towards fundamentalism may avert a present conflict, but for the same reason it is incompatible with that conflict's resolution. The digital geometry of Dragon Age 2 bleeds Christian ideals. What other morality could occupy a city built by slavers to degrade slaves and then occupied by free men? The Christian trappings of DA2 are straightforward in some cases, as mentioned previously. But a huge amount of the plot is actually driven by a struggle within the Chantry itself to deal with the acceleration of social conditions in the Circle of Mages, and the continued emergence of blood magic. The game takes real historical Christian fears and gives them a substantive form, while also pulling no punches in the equally present villainy and corruption of the faithful themselves. The dominance of these themes suggests a story intent on presenting itself to the player from a fundamentally Christian, or at least Abrahamic, perspective. The changing technological landscape of the world of Thedas is present in the emergence of the Red Lyrium, a corrupted version of the energy resource that supplies mages and Templars alike, making it an equal opportunity killer. The insanity of the Red Lyrium is very readily a metaphor for the social insanity of Kirkwall's emergent system, and the acts of all participants, willing or otherwise, intentional or otherwise, bring Thedas forward into a future where society risks reorganization by fire or destruction by darkness. And those bloody crystals have, I think, precisely that kind of Lovecraftian quality about them that Moore enumerates. In this way, Dragon Age 2 makes the bold choice of presenting an overly Christian-dominated environment with the plight of the oppressed in full focus, while keeping the frame of reference itself still decidedly Christian. I think the game risks a great deal in attempting to walk that particular line, but the payoff is distinct in its presentation of a sympathetic perspective. Some critics might argue that presenting more reactionary ideas in Christian trappings, we almost certainly don't need to discuss every actual parallel between the world of Thetis and ours, is an indictment of Christianity, or the other way around, that presenting those ideas as having any credit to them is overly permissive of bigotry. I think the fact that both of those perspectives have some proof to them is what's interesting. There's a lot about Dragon Age 2 that tempts us to simplistic analysis. For example, sure, Anders says he doesn't want anyone to be oppressed for how the Maker made them, but then he randomly blows up a building to show us how his ideas are too extreme, so maybe both sides are wrong. Dragon Age 2 says centrism is correct and the gays are just as bad as the church. But does it, though? I think if we can't admit there's something nuanced in the presentation of the stereotype of the overzealous revolutionary, then we're missing the emotional content of the work. Dragon Age 2 is begging us to earnestly bring ourselves into the conversation to gauge how we feel about those ideas, those characters and events. And if we're earnest about what we bring to it, what we find will be equally so. For me, this has meant writing about a number of different readings of its story. Queer oppression, found family, Christianity, class struggle, and anti-Semitism are just a few. When you look into that mirror, what would you see?